Welcome back to the Donkey Vote podcast with Francis.
Tobias.
And George. These interviews will be focusing on the past careers of politicians before they entered parliament.
With a strong intention to our audience that anything is achievable no matter what you studied in university or college.
If you like this sort of content, please make sure you like, subscribe, comment, and share with your friends. Also, we are on YouTube and Spotify, so make sure you follow us on those platforms.
Make sure to follow us on Instagram as well to keep updated with the latest episodes and reels that we release.
Enjoy
the interview.
We are joined by Eamon O Cuiv, the Fianna Fáil MP in the Dáil for Galway West. So, Eamon, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Yes. So I know I was saying just before, you've got a very illustrious history within politics within your family, being your grandfather being actually the founder of the Fianna Fáil political party. But could you give us a little brief description of yourself and maybe of your constituency of Galway West just before we get into the podcast?
Yes, I actually come from Dublin. My parents were living in Dublin when we grew up, and they had no connection with the west of Ireland. The only connection I had with the west of Ireland was that my aunt was a marine biologist in Galway University, and we used to stay in her house on holidays. But there was no other family connection with the west of Ireland. However, my parents were very interested in the Irish language. My father was a professor of Celtic, and they encouraged us to be interested in the Irish language. So when I grew up, I got involved in the Irish language movement. My wife was working in Dublin at the time, but when I met her, she was working in the public service in Dublin, but she was from Connemara. So when I graduated, I decided I'd like to work in the west of Ireland, and that's what I did. So it was a conscious choice, but I was 23 years of age at that time. I had been to university, and then I headed west to Galway West. Now, Galway West includes Galway City, a little bit of the good land to the east of Galway City. Now it changes, they change as the population changes, and then has Connemara. And Connemara is a very rugged area, northwest of the city. I live about in kilometres, 50 to 60 kilometres north of the city. And I live right up against the Mayo border. I've represented this area since 1992 in the Dáil. I was in our Senate from 89 to 92, having run unsuccessfully for the Dáil twice. So I've just completed 35 years as a member of the Oireachtas of the Parliament, as we call the Oireachtas, we call the Parliament, what you call the Parliament.
Yes. Yeah, there's some differences there between, of course, the Irish Dáil and the Australian Parliament in a sense as well. But yeah, it's good to see that there's a lot more it's good to see that and hear that growing up in Dublin, you eventually found your way to the West Coast. I probably have a bit of bias there, but I do find the West Coast a bit better than Dublin itself. Having a lot of family still in County Clare, as I was saying before, Eamon. So, it's interesting as well to, talking a little about Irish language and, Gaelic. And I know it's quite dying out, in a lot of parts of Ireland as well. So it's good that, your family's very interested in, keeping the Irish language going. Because unfortunately for me, my great grandfather didn't really teach any of his kids, my great grandfather and his siblings, any of the Gaelic language. So, it's really died out within my family. But hopefully a lot of Irish families nowadays, can continue to speak the language fluently.
Yeah, well, part of the movement towards the independence of Ireland was a revival of the Irish language. So I would come from a family that were very involved in the revival of the Irish language intergenerationally. Back to three of my grandparents were activists. And the situation of the Irish language is complex. It is the first official language of the state. There are about 80,000 daily Irish speakers. There's a lot more, of course, that understand it. There's something like 2 million people who claim to have a reasonable knowledge of Irish. It's taught to everybody in the schools. And interestingly, for a language that had been pushed to the margins of society in the 19th century, when you do these sociological surveys, you find the people who are most favourable towards the language are the upper middle classes in places like Dublin. So there has been a very interesting sociological movement behind the language, bringing it to a place of very high prestige in Irish society. And what we also found in sociological studies, Irish speakers are considered an in-group in society. Lots of people would like to be an Irish speaker. They wouldn't object to a family member having an Irish speaker as a partner or a next door neighbour as their next door neighbour. So it's a very much one of the in-groups in Irish society, not a marginal group out on the side. And most people in Ireland believe that the language belongs to them. So we have an Irish language television, does a lot of broadcasting of sports, rugby, Gaelic games, hurling and football and so on. And what you find is people have enough Irish to follow commentaries when they're interested in the sport. So it's a complex situation with the Irish language. And I, for a long time, was minister with responsibility for the language. So you were dealing with the rights of the native speakers, the people who use it on a daily basis. And you were dealing with the people who were learning it or who were just, had a certain knowledge of it and were empathetic towards it. In my constituency is unusual. We have the biggest Irish-speaking areas in the country. And when I go to my office, I obviously have Irish speakers in the office. They can speak English as well, of course, everybody can. But the lingua franca is the Irish language. And when the constituents come in, we deal with them in whichever language they choose. But the Irish speakers inevitably choose the Irish language, even though all of us can speak English.
It's quite good as well that, you have that capability of catering just not only for constituents who speak just English, but also constituents who may prefer to speak Gaelic and Irish language over English. So that's a good thing to have in the office. And I know with a lot more, different ethnic groups as well in Australia coming in, it's a really, really important thing for a lot of constituency offices, to have people of different language groups and, of different cultures being able to be there so they can communicate, especially with, the MPs who represent quite multicultural constituencies.
Yeah, but I suppose unusually in our case, the internal notes we write to each other are in Irish, not in English. So amongst each other, if we go out for a meal or anything, the staff and myself, the two staff I have, I don't have a big staff, but we would talk Irish to each other, not English.
Really? As well?
So obviously we can all talk English. I can talk English.
Yeah.
They can talk English. They're equally adapted English, but Irish is what we speak amongst each other. And the same thing at home. Myself, my wife, my children, and even the children who are abroad. I have one in Brisbane in Australia, and he and his partner talk Irish to each other, and they would talk Irish to us when they get on video links and so on. The son in San Francisco is the same thing. It's not. We don't think there's any issue here. It's just the language we speak, and like speaking English, it's just the language we speak.
It's just the easiest language, and it's the one that comes to mind. So why not speak it as much as possible?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, and it's just a habit. If I started talking English to my children, they think
they think something's wrong at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's correct.
So yeah, thanks for that, Eamon. So I think we'll move on to our questions for you, and I know we have limited time, so I'll get straight into them. So my first question actually to you is, how was your high school and university life? I know that was quite a long time ago, Eamon, but hopefully you can remember quite a number of moments from there. So do you have any memorable moments as well that you would like to share on the podcast?
Well, I went to a school that focused on, what we did was 4 languages and then physics, chemistry, maths, and applied maths. And I did very well in my final year in school in maths, applied maths, physics, and chemistry. And I took the lazy way out, and I went to college, studied those in first year, and then my degree is in maths, physics, and chemistry. So I actually have a science degree. I think that's been hugely beneficial to me. It gives you an analytical mind. You learn to resolve problems by being systematic. I think that helped me later on in life, all my way through life. I then got a job as a co-op manager. Now, the co-op didn't really exist. They had collected a shareholding of 3,500 Irish pounds at the time, which would be about, I think, 5,000 or 6,000 Australian dollars. It wasn't an awful lot of money. And the idea was to use government grants to try set up, to improve the farming situation, but also to create jobs. So I departed, and the first project we undertook was to set up a sheep fattening station for 2,000 female sheep, for 2,000 lambs. And because the lambs coming off the mountains weren't heavy enough to sell on the market. The oil crisis kind of defeated that, so we turned to timber milling. But we set up a store, we rented land then, and we sheep farmed over about 1,000 acres. And we set up an Irish college where the students come in the summer to learn Irish and stay in the houses and so on. So we set up a multifaceted business, trying to create income for the local people in remote in Irish terms, because there's no such thing as remoteness in Australian terms in Ireland. So as I said, we were about 50 kilometres from the major nearest big towns of Castlebar and Galway. But it was an area of hills, lakes, poor infrastructure and so on. The timber mill eventually was taken over by somebody who approached me, could they take it over? We were struggling with it. We did sell it on, and he has made it literally the biggest timber mill in the whole of Ireland, north or south.
And
the credit goes to us of having started it. The credit goes to him of having created what's there today.
And developed it and put more infrastructure and more, and invested more into it. So it's one of now the biggest timber mills in the whole of Ireland. And I was going to say as well, Eamon, relating to that, were there any sort of skills you had within working for that company around agricultural services that you now use in your political career?
Yes, everything. Because I had to start off and I had to learn the tax system, because we had to set up a payroll system. I had to learn about all the social welfare and its interface with people's lives, because these were small farmers, in many cases, getting some payment from social welfare to top up their income, to give them a subsistence income. So I had to learn an awful lot about an awful lot of things. I had to buy the land on which the cooperative built the premises. So I had to learn all about land registry and so on. So there wasn't a thing that came across my life later on that I didn't learn something about during my years in the co-op. For example, many years later, I set up a scheme and we were providing infrastructure in rural areas. And one of the things we did was provide 3-phase electricity for small industries in rural areas. How did that come about? That came about because I had experienced the same challenge when we set up the mill. We had to run the first machine off a tractor because the single phase electric power wasn't sufficient to run your heavy duty equipment. So I would say that an awful lot of what I brought to politics was not the ancestral knowledge that people always refer to, but was actually my on the ground trying to get businesses going in a rural area and hold the community with me at the same time. And that's one of the big skills in politics. One thing is knowing what needs to be done. But in politics, because it's democratic, you also have to sell your ideas to people. And at times, to get them to accept difficult decisions and stick with you and trust you that you're doing it for the good. And, I learned that there were times that business was slack and we had to let staff go. You couldn't keep people that you couldn't afford to pay. And you had to develop skills of how you communicate this so that people would accept the hard decisions. And that has stood to me in huge stead in politics.
And completely agree there as well, because sometimes there's going to be tough decisions that got to be made, and you cannot please every single constituent 100% of the time. And there's always going to be someone who's going to have a problem or try and challenge you on a different issue within the local community, for example, or within the wider country of Ireland in a sense. So it's really, really important to be able to stick to your guts and communicate well with constituents about the way you're progressing with certain issues, because it may not seem as if you're doing much now, but in the future, hopefully, constituents will be able to see the benefits of what you did in the long run.
Well, yeah, and I was very lucky. I'm long enough in politics for people to see a lot of the benefits of what I did. And sometimes, of course, you do things and people are really pleased at the time, but as time moves on, younger generations forget the way it was. There are a few roads in our area. It's very interesting. We managed to upgrade the main roads, particularly because of the timber mill, over my time in politics, because with all the trucks coming in, we needed much better infrastructure. And there are other roads, little roads into the townlands, as we call them, that are not much wider than they were initially. It's only when you drive those roads and say, this is what the main road was like, that you realize actually how much change we brought about. But there were a whole lot of things we did in the area. One thing that is interesting and that I'm very proud of, every year, or every 4 years, they do when they do the census, we get the data. And the socioeconomic profile of the area in which I live is very, very good. It's above the average, national average, where most areas of Connemara would be slightly behind. So we actually defeat the syndrome that a lot of rural areas face, that they're poorer than the national average. Our area shows up very well in socioeconomic analysis, and it's something I'm very pleased about.
I guess it's, again, around the time you spend in Parliament, Eamon, and being able to invest and being able to put in that critical infrastructure, which is allowed for your area that you live in to blossom, and for jobs to be created and people to try and live there as it's a more desirable area. So I guess it's credit to what you've done in the last 32 years in Parliament.
Oh, well, I mean, all the schemes I ran were national schemes, so they were equally applicable to other rural areas of the type that I was living in. And I did a particular amount of work in the least developed rural areas because they have huge potential. And one of the things I always felt, as somebody who'd worked on the ground in a rural area, the problem there is untapped potential. It's not that they always need to be subsidized by the state. They can generate good economic income, but they have to be given the basic facilities, whether it's broadband, three-phase electricity, roads, transport services, and so on, to do that. And I would always say, if you really did an analysis, and maybe when I retire now, I'll get a chance to do a bit more research into things like this. The actual investment per capita in the cities is often much higher than in the rural areas. But people always seem to begrudge investment in rural areas. And for example, a point that I used to often point out, the subsidy for Dublin Bus is twice the subsidy for the company that provides the bus services for the rest of the country, even though the population of Dublin is only 30% of the population of the country. So the disparity between how we fund public transport in our cities is totally in favor of the cities, whereas most people would have this unthinking perception that running rural buses is incredibly expensive. One of the reasons it's not, of course, is that we have very bad rural services. But even if you gave us good rural services, what we found out is we do get the passengers, and you are putting a bit more money in. You're just leveling up the playing pitch, but you're not tilting it in favor of the rural areas.
Exactly, an even spread of services there, and an even spread of investment is so crucial to delivering better outcomes for all people of any country in the world. So I do want to talk about our next question then, Eamon, just because we are limited for time. So additionally, when you entered Parliament, while you entered Parliament and while you've been in Parliament, you served in many ministerial portfolios and roles, such as the Minister for Defence and Social Protection, and eventually becoming the Deputy Leader of the Fianna Fáil Party in 2011. Can you talk to us a little bit about your career in ministry and your leadership career within Fianna Fáil? And do you have any specific regrets from that time?
Well, I suppose every day you would have hoped to get something extra done. And if you weren't ambitious that way, and I always had more ideas than I ever achieved, but kind of looking back then, I say, that's human life. Nobody ever achieved everything they set out to achieve. I'm satisfied I used my time well. So initially when I became, first of all, you have to be an MP, as you'd call it, to become a minister in the Irish government. That's the first
or
basic
TD
rule.
in the Dáil.
We call them TDs, Teach the Dáil, messengers to the Dáil. So in other words, they're the people's messenger, they're the people's representative. It's very important in the Irish psyche of politics. So the reality was I was first appointed Minister of State, which is a junior minister, in the Department of Arts, Heritage, Gaeltacht and the Islands. And I had special responsibility for the Gaeltacht and the islands. Now, that was a very interesting 3 years because my senior minister, my boss, in other words, was my own first cousin, Sheila de Valera. So I don't think it ever happened before that two first cousins were both the minister and
Hopefully it wasn't intentional at all, like that appointment.
It just happened because I was a very fluent Irish speaker and they were looking for somebody who could do the Gaeltacht job. So it was more accident than design, and my cousin Sheila was big into the arts. But anyway, that's as it happened. I then moved to the Department of Agriculture, where I had rural development and some of the agricultural programs under my remit. And then they changed the departments around, reconfigured them, and they set up a department of community, rural, and the Irish language, or Gaeltacht affairs as we call it, but the Irish language, inside and outside of Gaeltacht, north and south in the country. In other words, all the work going on with Northern Ireland post the Good Friday Agreement in relation to the language, Irish language particularly, but also Ulster Scots. I had Waterways Ireland, which are the canals and inland waterways, under my remit. So I had this department. It dovetailed very well. We had particular responsibility under community heading for very deprived urban areas. So we had the two ends of deprivation, the depopulated rural areas and the very, very deprived urban areas. And they were a huge challenge because they're often overlooked in cities. And in most cities, you have areas of significant deprivation where you get a lot of social issues with drug abuse and so on. Now, I know you could say drug abuse is pervasive, but it particularly hits gangland violence and so on. It particularly hits the poorer communities worse.
Which is totally, totally true there. So, that sort of ministerial work and that you were pushing at that point in time was so imperative to not only protecting the communities and bringing the best interest of the community at heart, but also protecting these people, getting them out of that cycle of crime and drug addiction at that point in time.
Yes, and one other thing, I often felt that when the state was dealing with communities, they were paternalistic. Now, having come from the other side, having been on the ground doing the work, we always believed that we were as smart as anybody. If you gave us the instruments we needed to self-develop, and that the people in any rural area in Ireland, education goes to a high level, and particularly in rural areas, you have a lot of very well-educated, very smart people. I used to also say that I had gone to Connemara with a degree, which was not so common in those days. There were plenty of people who had got degrees, but they'd gone off teaching somewhere or they'd moved out of the area. And on the other hand, I found that the locals had inherent traditional skills in terms of organization, in terms of developing things, in terms of physical ability to get things done when it came to buildings and designing roads and everything, that was absolutely extraordinary. And what we did was marry the two skills together. And I think we got a very potent force. And we really harnessed, and I later harnessed it in terms of political campaigning forces. We always reckoned that even though we were from a very small rural area with a small population, that we could put a bigger team in the field at any election time that could canvass the cities, the rural areas with effect and organization and discipline and smart. And no matter what was thrown them at the door, they always seemed to be able to engage in a positive and sensible way.
I totally agree with you there, Eamon. So I know we are very limited for time, so I think we might skip some questions here, and we'll move on to the next question for you in the interview. But Eamon, who would you say is your political role model or idol?
Well, I suppose the person who would have influenced me most as a political person in my youth, because it was the only one I knew that was directly involved in politics, was my grandfather. So Eamon de Valera got involved in the 1916 Rising, joined the Gaelic League before that. My grandmother had joined the Gaelic League in 1898, and she lived till 1975, the same year that he died. So both got a very long life. And he had entered really active politics after the Rising in 1917, got elected actually to the British Parliament, never took a seat, of course, because they set up their own parliament in 1919, became president of that parliament. You had the Civil War and so on, set up the Fianna Fáil party and was back in power in 1932. But remember, I could remember him. I was born 1950. So in the 50s, he was Taoiseach for 2 periods. And then he became president in 1959 when I was 9 years of age. And he was still president when I was 23 years of age and had actually moved. Well, it was just before I moved to Connemara. But he was still alive when I moved to Connemara, and he was very interested in the fact that I got a job in an area he knew well, and he was still very engaged with what we were doing. So he was a huge role model for us. One thing about him was he was very ordinary. He never got spoiled by all the fame he achieved. He was very grounded, and he was, he would think of the ordinary things that affected people.
Which is a very important thing, being probably the center of Irish, republicanism and the Irish state at that point in time, being the founder of it, and being longest serving president, continuously even now. He would have to be. It's a great thing that he was so grounded and he was so able to see past all the fame, but still deliver and still be able to serve the people that he was elected to represent.
Yes, but he was also, I remember one day we were up in Arsenal, which is the presidential house, and we were coming down the corridor. I don't know what started the conversation, but there must have been something in the paper about the fact that he had to walk 6 miles home from school to get a secondary education. And my mother, as all mothers would, said to him, she said, my dad, she said, the children wouldn't walk that far nowadays, kind of getting a dig at us. And he came back at her and he said, yes, but we fought so that they wouldn't have to walk. He didn't think there was some great benefit in having to go through such a hardship. And to me, that outlined his philosophy in one sentence. It was to better the life of ordinary people around the country. And I came across that when I got involved in politics in 1989. He was only 12 or 13 years dead. There were lots of people who remembered him, remembered his period in power. And the one thing that kept coming across was how many practical things he did, as well as the big nation building things, the Constitution, international affairs, League of Nations, and so on. How many practical day-to-day things he did for people.
The most important thing for all as well. And being able to relate to the people is so crucial as a politician. So it's great that you've got your grandfather there and you had some time, and since he only died when you were about in your mid-20s, Eamon. So you had a great time to speak to him and learn a lot from him before you went into your political career. So I do know we are very, very rushed for time, Eamon. So I will ask my final question for the podcast. So finally, what's one piece of advice you'd give to students in 2024, especially those who are starting university or high school?
Get involved. Not necessarily in politics. I think that can follow. I think you have to live your life. Get involved in sports, get involved in community activities, get involved in charities, get involved in helping other people. I think that's hugely important. Obviously, look after your studies. You have to get your studies done. But I think the biggest thing I find is that because I had such an involvement in doing things before I got involved in politics, I had a wealth of knowledge built up of how the world really works, of things that affect people on a daily basis. And I think that influenced my political career hugely after that, and made me a better politician. I think if I got in at 22, 23, you could get into what we call here the bubble, get isolated from day-to-day life in a way that you won't if you started rearing your own family, work experience and life's experience. I think that's the one advice I'd give to people, and to look after the study.
Exactly. And I think, if you are aspiring to become a politician, entering within, in your early 20s or mid 20s, it seems pretty good to join pretty early, but in a sense as well, you don't have that life experience. You don't have you don't really have a family and that sort of thing. Like, you haven't really started and you don't have your own kids and that sort of thing. So your life experience is very different to, the average person's at that point in time. So I guess, experiencing stuff in the private sector, working in the private sector, And getting experience in other industries is so important. But if you do want to run in politics, but as you said as well, prioritizing your studies as a student, currently, even as myself as a student, is so crucial. So, a lot of young people nowadays, I can talk about going to university now, and it's very, very different. Only like today, for example, I had my accounting class, and we only had about 10 people in the class. We normally have about 40, and we've got exams in 2 weeks' time. So it's quite different than some people's mindset and some people's priorities. But as you said, Eamon, the most important thing is always prioritizing your studies and always trying to work hard. Because at the end of the day, the effort you put in now reflects how well you can go into the future.
I think that's absolutely true, and I think it's key to everything. But
Yes.
as I said, engage with the world. That's
Yes.
also equally. One thing, certainly when our own children were growing up, we really encouraged them to be involved, and particularly in sport, um, because you meet a lot of people through sport. You learn to take
Exactly.
the knocks, to win some, lose some, and shake yourself off and move on. And I think those bonds are absolutely vital going forward. But it could be doing anything else. It could be playing chess. It could be doing anything. But I do think just studying is a little bit of a mistake.
Exactly. Yeah. Getting involved and doing other things outside of study is important. Study is really, really important, but having a balance and having a life outside of that is so crucial because studying all the time. Even though you might end up getting the great grades and that sort of thing, but those communication skills that you develop within a team, those communication skills you develop while working at the same time as studying, whether that be a part-time job or whether that be a casual job, are so crucial to furthering your career because employers love having someone who's getting high distinctions in university and that sort of thing. But if you can't communicate and you can't be creative and you can't think for yourself and you just all you can do is really just answer questions on a piece of paper. At the end of the day, you're not going to be a great employee. So having both communication skills and real life skills as well as also being a dedicated student is so crucial to furthering yourself not only now but into the future.
I absolutely agree.
Yes. So those are all our questions then for you, Eamon. I do really appreciate you again coming on the podcast and sparing some time. I know, you're coming up to an election in Ireland in the next couple of months, so it's quite a busy time. And I know since you're not going for election again, Eamon, this probably would have been the last time we might have had a chance to talk to you. So I do really, really, really appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking a bit about your high school and university life, your time in Parliament, and time in the Dáil, sorry, and some advice to give to students in 2024, especially those who start at university and high school. So, from the Donkey Fight podcast team and all our viewers, thank you again for coming on the podcast and speaking to us.
You're welcome. Mila
Yes.
File to You're very, very welcome.